A very warm welcome to this episode of our conversation series, Sustainability in the Next Era. The challenges of today are unlike anything we faced before. As many argue that the pandemic has a positive impact on the environment, boosting economic recovery would put extreme pressure on natural resources and on infrastructure services. Is the world ready to recover? Could the cities in MENA region drive a sustainable recovery? Cities contribute to almost 3/4 of the global CO2 emissions. By 2030, over 5 billion people will be living in cities, producing waste, consuming resources, and demanding more water, energy, food. Although cities sound like a challenging platform, they are also amazing opportunities to recover the economy, to create new opportunities, as well as to contribute to social welfare. With us today, we're very honored to have him, is Karim Elgendy, Associate Sustainability Architect at DAR and the founder of Carboun. Hello, Karim, and thank you for joining.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Karim, we are reading and hearing a lot about green cities, low carbon development, zero carbon buildings, as well as new plans by cities around the world to voluntarily commit to the SDGs and Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a lot going on. Can you please explain what are these initiatives and what's the difference so that people can maybe benefit from learning from you, but also maybe advocating for their cities to join some of those movements?
Okay, so I'll start in a descending order. So a zero carbon or carbon neutral city is the highest aspiration a city could have in terms of its climate commitments. It's a term that describes a city whose operations result in a net zero carbon emissions. In other words, it emits very little carbon, and whatever carbon it does emit, it does offset. Down from that are definitions such as low carbon city, which is a little bit more flexible, a little bit more ambiguous term. It presents an attempt to reduce carbon emissions by a certain percentage. Obviously, that percentage varies from one country to the other, also varies from one city to the other, also varies in terms of what the baseline from which that percentage took place. Zero carbon city is actually quite a challenging target to aim for, but it is doable for cities that already have a limited carbon footprint. For example, cities that do rely on 100% renewables, for example. We have a number of cities in the world that rely on 100% renewables for their electricity. There are 40 of them, for example, Brasilia and Addis Ababa and Basel in Switzerland. And if you extend that to over 70% of electricity from renewable sources, you'll get over 100 cities around the world. They include Stockholm and Zurich in Europe. You include Dar es Salaam and Montreal and Seattle and even parts of Vancouver.
Thank you, Karim. And how about our region? Are there any examples of cities moving forward with such concepts that you can share with us?
So in terms of zero carbon, I believe the only city that has committed to a zero carbon by 2050 is Amman in Jordan. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that is the only example where the aspiration has been set at 100% reduction or zero carbon. But other cities around the region are taking efforts. Casablanca and Rabat are doing quite well in terms of their pledges to reduce their carbon emissions. Again, the pledges and the reductions aimed for vary from one city to the other. They're not 100%, but they are taking measures in those cities. Likewise in Dubai and Amman, obviously, where there are moves to improve the mobility network towards a more energy efficient one. We're also seeing investments in demand side management, renewable energy, and energy efficiency in buildings in Dubai as well. And if you expand the scope of the MENA region to include Turkish cities, for example, you'll find a whole range of Turkish cities with climate action pledges as well.
And it's interesting because Amman, on one hand, for example, is a non-oil producing city or in a non-oil producing country, while Dubai is. So what are the incentives for different cities to adopt such measures and strategies?
Well, Amman needs to reduce its carbon emissions because it needs to find ways to source the energy in the first place in a way that they don't have to import. In the case of Jordan, it's a unique situation because they don't actually have the energy resources. So carbon emissions come from that. It's a case where both energy security and energy efficiency, or reducing carbon emissions through renewables, align nicely. In the case of Dubai, it's an attempt to diversify. It's also an attempt to reduce its very high carbon footprint.
And from your experience, is finance an issue? So if a city has the passion, has the commitment, has this voluntary, let's say, inclination to adopt low carbon or sustainable measures, how would they get the financing if they come from, let's say, a modest socioeconomic standard?
Where would they get the financing from? Well, it all depends on the measures taken. I'd like to start from where the strategy is and then work my way down. But some of the sustainable urban sustainability measures to reduce carbon emissions, for example, such as renewables, have become highly competitive, and bringing the private sector into them has become quite a profitable business for companies that do engage in this kind of action. So from that point of view, there's no real issue with finance. The challenges tend to be technical when it comes to renewables. In terms of mobility and everything to do with retrofitting buildings or retrofitting or urban retrofitting mobility networks into the urban fabric of the city, these tend to be more challenging. As a matter of fact, anything to do with urban retrofitting is quite an expensive endeavor to take. Densification, which is quite critical to the success of urban mobility, is also quite an expensive measure, and also quite a slow one as well. And this is an issue for both wealthy countries and less wealthy countries. So wealthy cities and less wealthy cities. And in a way, put it this way, wealthy cities are trying to achieve something slightly different from what poorer cities are trying to do. They're trying to transform themselves in a way that reduces their environmental footprint, including carbon, while maintaining their operations and their prosperity. While poorer cities, on the other hand, they start from a position where the cities are not actually operating optimally. They lack resilience, and they don't actually reap the benefits of urbanization.
So how do you see the integration of the human side is happening? And especially in MENA, we have a lot of consumption and production patterns that need to be revisited. And we also have a lot of religious and faith background that could be utilized to promote more sustainable practices. So how do you see city planners and let's say those working on the carbon issues, but also on the environmental issues, taking this into account?
Well, there are multiple ways of doing this. There's the stakeholder engagement, which is an issue that we don't have a strong track record in the MENA region for doing. The localization agenda will support that greatly by engaging locals in a particular neighborhood, a particular district, and engaging them in the decision-making process rather than a top-down planner-led development process. So that's one side of it. The issue of consumption that you have raised can be clearly leveraged through faith-based organizations across the region. It's not a difficult thing, not even a leap of rationalization here. Is quite a straightforward thing to introduce. The human factor is also critical in terms of environmental justice and also in terms of equity. Well, the cities are historically places for improving economic efficiency. This is why cities exist. But in this process of driving economic efficiency, we have left behind equity. We've left behind some social factors. And we've also left behind the environmental footprint of this economical development that we're seeking. And in rectifying this imbalance, we have to work hand in hand, rectifying the environmental imbalances and also rectifying the social imbalances as well.
And on that end, do you think we have enough communication and outreach and maybe even education to actually instill the values of sustainable cities within the minds of people?
We don't do enough. I mean, when I started 10 years ago, there was hardly anyone talking about sustainability in the MENA region, let alone in cities. But at the moment, there's a young generation of sustainability enthusiasts who are happy to dedicate some of their time towards promoting these issues. So there are some moves, but they're definitely not doing enough. And there's a degree of elitism going on as well, where where the communication happens in an echo chamber of sorts, and we're not necessarily communicating with a wider group of people in the local language. And I think that is something that could be rectified.
And this brings me to one of my favorite questions to all speakers, but specifically those with kind of young, let's say, mentality. How do you see the voluntary work and volunteerism and all these non-for-profit efforts contributing to the change in the region, especially that you also have a job and then you have your own foundation running to do other stuff, and I know you're engaged in doing a lot of publications, speeches and talks and webinars and so on. So how do you see the young people in the region actually managing their time to fulfill both their work commitments, but also their passion and their social commitments?
Well, you'll be surprised. A lot of people are actually passionate about the subject, and they would like to make a difference. And some people see this as their own social responsibility. And I'm happy to introduce you to our enthusiastic volunteers who see this as part of their life. Some of them see synergies with their work, with the consulting work. So in a way, they could observe the sustainability scene while at the same time contributing to it in a professional capacity, and that's a good lens. It provides this ability to be critical of one's own work, so that some of them find that beneficial. In terms of their time and management, obviously depends on personal circumstances, but you'd be surprised as a degree of passion one does find in the youth of this region.
Great, I have no doubt, because I see them every day, and I'm so proud of all of those volunteers and passionate people, because this is how change happens. My last question, Karim, is if you were put in a decision-making or policy-making position, and you would like to enable and empower cities to drive the process of moving towards a more sustainable future, whether it's low carbon, more energy efficiency, or even more sustainable consumption, production, any of the environmental goals, let's say, or sustainable development goals, how would you go about it? Like, what are the things that you'd love to see happening so that cities can play that role?
Sure. So after inauguration, I will set up a range of sustainability and resilience goals, and then work downwards from that to identify measures, urban measures that you could do to achieve those goals. So for example, if one of the goals is to reduce carbon emissions, then you'll identify the range of measures that can contribute to that. Perhaps more public transportation, perhaps more renewable energy, perhaps building retrofits. There's a range of things that you could do, for example, to improve carbon emissions or reduce carbon emissions, if that is one of your goals. But then critically, I believe it's important also to identify the synergies between these different measures, and also identify low-hanging fruit, because this is where the opportunities lie, especially when you don't actually have significant amount of financial resources at your disposal. So one measure that can yield multiple benefits would be better than one measure that can only yield one benefit. So this is, in my view, a critical opportunity once you've identified your measures to carry out that exercise and identify both low-hanging fruit and also synergies that can allow you to perhaps achieve your resilience goals and your sustainability goals at the same time. And then moving on from that, I would have to assess the job creation opportunity from each of those measures, and work with the private sector, work with the NGOs and the wider community to identify avenues or potential for collaboration with them in implementing some of these measures that can yield those jobs. So that's kind of how I would work down from.
So if, we should vote for you then.
I will introduce my candidacy soon. And thank you for identifying me as young here. I really appreciate it.
Well, I think it's about the mentality and about the youth of the heart and soul in continuous work and creation. So I think you are a great creator and innovator and a hard worker. And thank you so much, Karim, for being with us today.